first, I really do want to thank you all for being here. And I can tell you, this is an incredible panel. And I guarantee you're not going to feel like you wasted your time here. This will be a very meaningful panel. First, we'd like to thank Jay for coordinating this, and we're so honored to be working with Ty. And this has become a really important issue in this industry and with this group. And it's going to become even more important as time goes on. It's just the beginning of it. And so we're, as usual, Ty's ahead of the ball game in this area. So the essence of this talk today is really about all the changes in the Trump administration, and we always hear about illegal immigration and all the noise that gets. But quietly, legal immigration has been severely attacked in a sense, and there is a lot more restrictions on it, and you don't have to change any laws the way they're implementing these things. So I will tell you, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because they're the more important people, but this panel is great. If you really had the whole industry, the immigration attorneys, if they knew there was a panel with Ira Kurtzban and Carolyn Lee and Can-Am, you could fill this room with immigration experts. So let me just give you a little background on these people. Ira Kurtzban, and he doesn't know I'm going to say this, is a national treasure. And he has throughout his career worked on pro bono work, refugees, just every aspect of immigrations and helping people. And he's numerous awards, you can look at it, but he's also been selected by Newsweek as one of the 100 American heroes. So, he's the past president, he's the former general counsel for the Immigration Law Association, and the most widely used book in the industry is Kurzban. Book on immigration, and you'll see judges holding it when they're doing immigration cases. So and he's had extensive experience with EB-5 and early on and handling some of the really more difficult cases. So and I'll never say all these nice things to Ira again, but it is amazing. And Carolyn Lee is obviously, she's a really prominent author and lecturer and well-respected person in EB-5. She is a lawyer's lawyer in this industry. Lawyers go to her for her advice. She's the chair of the American Immigration Lawyers Association EB-5 committee. She's always on the best lawyers. And I didn't know this, but I just saw this. In 2018, the best lawyers under the immigration category, number one was Carolyn. So you can see you really do have the best of the best here. In Can-Am, we've been around doing 30 years. We've done immigration-linked investments. I think we're here. I think we have we're clearly a leader in this industry, and our reputation and track record in this business is second to none. And on the panel here for Can-Am, we've got Nilesh, who's going to be. He was actually a Can-Am investor. He's got a tremendous amount of corporate and finance experience over 20 years. So believe me, he did his homework on this. We're so honored that he is going to be representing us. He lives in the Silicon Valley, and he's going to be representing us here, and we're really excited about that. And Jeff DeChico he's the president and CEO of our broker-dealer, Cammon Investor Services. You'll learn more that these are securities, these investments, and the SEC looks at this, and obviously you want to play by the rules, and Jeff is in charge of our entire broker-dealer plus our global growth development. And so, he's one of the stars at Can-Am, and we're so thrilled to have them all here. But again, I'm just going to turn it over to Carolyn, who's going to be the moderator for this. But thank you for coming, and I think you'll find this really informative. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Tom and Jay and everyone here. What I know about Ty is that it brings the best of the best in content, and you are not going to be disappointed tonight. So honored to be here. So we are going to kick things off with the backdrop in immigration. And there is no one better to give us the sense of what's happening in the immigration landscape than Mr. Ira Kurzban. So we're going to start with him. Ira, how would you describe what's happening with U.S. immigration?
Oh, everything's wonderful. It's incredible. You know, I was thinking about this in the long run. You know, if you look at American history and American immigration history, we've always had ups and downs. I mean, historically in the 1850s, we had a very strong anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, and even the earliest days and at the beginning of the 18th century, we had the Alien Enemies Act, which was one of the first acts created by President, I guess, Jefferson and Adams. Adams didn't like Jefferson. Jefferson was sympathetic to the French, so they passed the Alien Enemies Act as a way of trying to chase the French out of the United States. But, and, you know, we went through this in the 19-teens and so forth, and I don't want to bore you with the whole history, but we had something called the National Origins Quota System in the United States until 1965, when we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which also included a Civil Rights Act for immigrants. So one of the things you can't do under our law is discriminate based on national origin, race, sex, and so forth. Quite interesting, of course, is the era that we're living in now.
Interesting is a good word.
Which I think kind of surpasses what most people expected. And by that I meant it was obvious in the campaign that was run by Trump that one of the hallmarks of his campaign was kind of this anti-immigrant sentiment, but it seemed to have been directed toward Mexicans and Muslims, right? The wall, and then there was the travel ban. In fact, it is far more widespread than I think people really understand in our system. I think this administration is really committed, and hire American, buy American. They're truly committed to significantly dropping levels of immigration in the United States across the board. So it's not just illegal aliens or people with their kids coming over. And we're beginning to see that in a lot of different areas. 40% decrease, right, in this past fiscal year on EB, employment-based visas. We're seeing obvious decreases, and I'm sure many of you know it, on H-1Bs, the difficulty with getting these passed. And the way they're doing it is they're doing it in a very clever way, because the people who are doing this are very smart. And I know them for a long time, and I don't underestimate their abilities. And what they're doing is they are nitpicking all of the cases, and they are slowing down everything. For example, right now there's a backlog of 725,000 naturalization applications. We've never had that in our history. We have, if you're married to an American citizen, the waiting times used to be 6 months, 3 months, 5 months. It's now about a year and a half. So it's another way of slowing immigration down, kind of grinding it to a halt.
So the agency is denying and they're delaying.
Right, denying and delaying, and I think that's kind of the hallmark of what they're trying to do. In the H-1B area, you're seeing them do things that we've never seen before, and giving really kind of oddball interpretations to regulations, and resulting in notices of intent to deny and people going back and forth. And again, it's all under the umbrella of hire American, buy American. So I think that's the word that's gone out. What does it mean in terms of the long run? You know, it depends on what happens, right? I mean, it depends on what happens politically in the United States this November. It depends on what happens in 2020. But these things have a tendency in American history to kind of go in waves. And we're in a bad cycle now. I think we're going to come out of that cycle. I'm very optimistic about the future, because I don't believe it can be sustained. It's bad for our economy, obviously. to be turning away highly educated people like yourselves. It's not good for our foreign policy to be doing what we're doing, and so forth. So I think in the sense of where are we going, obviously the point of this conference, I think, is among the bright spots is to talk about EB-5, because for whatever bizarre reason, maybe it's all the lawsuits we did, Tom, I don't know, but for whatever bizarre reason, they really don't seem to have gone down the path of figuring out how to deny all of these cases. So you're getting more cases.
It's all the good lawyers in this space.
Huh?
It's all the good lawyers in this space.
Right. Well, I don't know, but well.
Yes.
Yes, of course. So you really kind of have a different trend in EB-5. And by the way, the trend on H1s is also true of L1s. It's true of E1s, where they're doing the same thing. They're finding clever ways in which to deny or delay applications. But EB-5, for I think a lot of different reasons, political reasons and otherwise, has been on kind of an even keel in terms of the approvals and so forth. So, I mean, if that's something that all of you are looking at or considering, that hasn't changed very much. You know, and I've been doing EB-5 cases since the, I hate to admit it because it makes me seem much older than I am. I'm really only 35. But, you know, I've been doing them since the 90s, the mid-90s, and you know, it's pretty constant. I mean, there was a drop, obviously, until 2008, then it picked up, and it's the problems with EB-5 right now are the successes, right? I mean, we have too many people applying. What that will mean, we don't know. We're working. We just filed a lawsuit last week in Washington, D.C. to challenge the way that they count visas. Because if they don't count family members and they just count the investors, we're going to have lots more visas. Right now, they count each family member. Each family member gets a visa of the investors. That's why there appear to be less visas than there actually are. And Carolyn has been kind enough also to work on the administrative and legislative side of that. We're going to try and get something in legislation if we can that would change how they count visas. And if they do that, we have a possibility of having lots more. So I'll just stop there, give you kind of an overview. And
thank you so much, Ira. So just a word about this important litigation that Ira has undertaken with his partners. It's seminal, and the hope is that this litigation that was filed recently with the DC District Court will fan a larger movement for us to expand visa capacity in EB-5. We have good legislative history that Ira and his team and other wonderful lawyers in the EB-5 bar have unearthed that supports the idea that it was always legislative intent to allow 10,000 investors to come into our country and create 100,000 jobs and not limit that to a fraction of that, a third of that. So wish us luck. It's going to benefit us all. So what I'm going to talk about is roadblocks to immigration that you are all facing and living, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And why you're here, because of the possible EB-5 solution that we have. So you know about the roadblocks. Ira has set the stage in terms of the general challenging environment we're all in. And you know that you get in, the H-1B is about whether or not you even can play. There's a lottery involved, and for the last several years, there's been an oversubscription of that process, so you don't know whether you will even get through that process. And then once you're through the process, you're so excited, you're in the lottery, we're faced with ever toughening adjudication standards in the H-1B. So the agency seems geared to getting to a no on these petitions, even if you get in the lottery. And then once you get the H, hooray, you know that you are bound to the confines of that petition. You've got to work within the bounds of that petition for that employer in that capacity. And your spouse's work authorization, very limited, and it may go away altogether. So, and then you manage all of that, and your employer sees your value and files your green card petition. You've got an I-140, and now it's become painfully clear that we have a decades-long backlog for Indian professionals who have filed their I-140s. So you've got to be looking at other options, right? This can't be the end of the road, waiting decades for an EB-2, 3, or 1 based green card. So that's where EB-5 comes in, and it makes a world of sense for you to be here and to learn about EB-5. It may not be for every one of you, but every one of you needs to be considering it and getting information about it, and that's why we're here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about the EB-5. It's a green card category, EB-1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and it's for entrepreneurs and investors. And the requirements are pretty basic. The investor has to invest. The entrepreneur has to invest $500,000 if the investment is located in a targeted employment area, which is a rural area or high unemployment area. $1 million if you're not in a TEA. The investment has to be in an entity. We call it the new commercial enterprise. It's a term of art in the EB-5 statute. The new commercial enterprise has to create at least 10 jobs, 10 U.S. jobs for every investor investing in that new commercial enterprise. All of that is put to USCIS in a petition, an I-526 petition. This is the analog to your I-140, I-526 for EB-5. And that petition is going to have two parts. It's going to have your part, which talks about you as the investor and your lawful source of funds for your EB-5 investment. And then it's going to have a second part. And the second part is going to be about the project, the business that you've invested into. And that part's going to talk about how, as a result of this investment, the business enterprise is going to create the required jobs within the required period of time. So that's step one. It's a three-step process. The 526 is filed with USCIS, and it's got to cook for 18 to 24 months. Once it's approved, the investors go into the second phase, which is consular processing if you're not in the United States, and adjustable. For most of you, you are adjustable. So 526 is approved. You go into adjustment of status filing, assuming that your priority date is current. With the adjustment of status filing, you apply for work and travel permit as well for yourself and your family. Once that process is completed, you are now a conditional permanent resident. So it's the same old adjustment of status application. It's approved, you're a conditional permanent resident. Same thing as a permanent resident. You have all the rights and obligations. You can work, not work, travel. You have to maintain residence in the United States. It's conditional, though, which means that you've got the conditional residency status for 2 years, and then at the end of the 2 years, you have to file your third petition, which is the petition to remove the conditions. And it's at that phase you show USCIS with a third filing. Look, I said what I was going to do. I invested, and my investment created 10 jobs. Created. Now you're looking back and saying I created, or the new commercial enterprise created the 10 jobs. So that is the process in a nutshell. I'm going to talk very briefly about the distinction between a regional center investment and a direct investment. So Can-Am is a regional center. It is designated by USCIS to operate as a regional center. is required to make annual filings with USCIS to maintain its designation. And your investment through Can-Am is going to be pooled, and that pooled capital is going to go into select projects that you select, and jobs will be created as a result of that. In the direct context, an investor invests into the new commercial enterprise. The new commercial enterprise will be required to show direct jobs. And direct jobs only means that these are jobs that are created by the new commercial enterprise directly, and the new commercial enterprise is the employer. And there have to be 10 jobs, 10 employees, identified John, Mary, Jim, Bob, 6 others, tax records, employment records, payroll records, showing that they're full-time US workers. In the regional center context, this is the sole distinction legally. Job creation need not be direct. That's because regional centers, the whole point of the regional center program is to allow for pooled capital, to have multiplier effects in terms of the impact to the economy. You're going to have lots of investors pulled into a commercial enterprise. It's going to use that pooled capital in a project, and it's going to have these widespread regional impacts, including job creation. So based on that model, the job creation does not have to be direct. You don't have to show direct employment. You can show that the jobs will be created indirectly, which means that the job creation impact can be shown by modeling, which is the same way that the government establishes job creation and positive economic impacts. In fact, the job creation models that most regional centers use, RIMS2, IMPLAN, these are models that came out of the US government. So those are the 2 types of EB5 investments and the process in a nutshell. And we're going to turn it over to somebody who has lived that process, Nilesh.
Yes.
So Nilesh, please tell our audience about your own experience and why did you pursue the EB5 visa? What made you think to go that route? And were you here in the United States or were you in India?
Yeah, so my name is Nilesh Shah, and I am like anybody in this room. All of us here have started off of having a dream to live and work in the United States. Some of them have come here through H-1B, and I was in India. I was a venture capital private equity investor looking at opportunities in the Indian market. Some of you who are from India would have heard of names like Reliance Industries, Reliance Capital Mutual Fund, Enam Securities. So I worked with very large multi-billion-dollar funds, and that was the aspiration to do work in the United States. And there was also the inspiration, and the inspiration was my family. They were the ones who inspired me that they wanted to be here. Luckily, I'm proud that they are here right now, somewhere at the back. And that was the inspiration for me to really make it happen. My daughter, she wants to study here. She wants to do a startup here in the Silicon Valley. I agreed to fund her college here in the University of California on the condition that she won't drop out and do a startup. But yeah, that was the aspiration, to play in the investments ecosystem here. The EB5 visa was a good way for me to plan my career here because it gives me the flexibility. With the green card, I really do not need to be really affiliated with one organization. I can do multiple activities. I can look at different investment structures. So EB5 was practically the only way for me to structure my legal presence in the United States. When I started looking at EB5, it was sometime in 2013. And that time it was actually unheard of in India. It was always a Chinese play in those days. I think I probably was among the first 30 people who looked at it and actively went about.
You're a pioneer.
Yeah, in some ways, yes. But, we always look for, opportunities before they become mainstream. That's what we do as investors.
As entrepreneurs, yes.
And that's what I did even with the entire EB5 space. So, yeah, this is a safe, legal way to bring the whole family here and give them, each one can follow their own pursuits.
So, so what was your process? So it sounds like at some point you realized I want to be in the United States. I don't want to work for an employer, so this is the path for me. So after you made that decision, what was your process?
You see, there are many things that one looks at when you're doing the EB-5 process, because the EB-5 is like a complex project. There are a lot of moving parts into it. One needs to look at finance and investment, someone needs to look at accounting and tax, one needs to look at the immigration law aspect of it. So there are multiple things that go on. And I'm a chartered accountant, I'm an investor, so I kind of understand the whole process. And this is very important, for all of you here. And if there is only one thing that you take away from my talk today, this is the thing that you need to know. That the easiest thing for me to do is the selection of the regional center. Because what really happened for me is that as an investor, I do this for a living. What matters is, what mattered for me, and I guess it matters for everybody, is the trust, the track record, and the credibility of the regional center. That is what mattered to me. And once I started looking at that, the entire process became very simple for me. The choice was easy for me to make. Canon was my choice, but that was not, it's not as if, I entered it without looking at everything else. So yes, I looked at accounting, tax, I looked at immigration, I looked at investments, but when it came to regional center, all that mattered for me was the trust, the credibility, and the track record.
And so how was Can-Am successful in gaining your trust?
As I said, I'm an investor. I deal with a lot of entrepreneurs. I look at a lot of projects. And what do we see? We see there are three things we see as an investor. And Vish is here, and he will also say the same thing. We look at what do they say they will do? Mm-hmm. Do they actually do what they say that they do? And how did they do whatever they did? This is what we look at whenever we're looking at an investment. This is exactly the same process I adopted when I was looking at my regional center choices. And this is how credibility is built. This is how trust is built. The decision for me to do, there is a why part of it, which I explained, and the how part of it was very easy, because I based it not on the IRR of the project or the payback of the project or the coupon of the project. I based it purely on the trust, the credibility, and the track record of the whole investment. That's how I approached it. That's how I approach my regular daily investing work, and it's no different. You need to look at credibility. That is in the essence of it.
I would agree.
And just to add to that, so Nilesh, when we say he was a pioneer in EB-5, in 2014 when he invested, we had only 5 investors from India, and he was one of the 5. This year we'll have over 200. So India was not even on the radar in EB-5. Not that you made it happen, but before Nilesh.
So you made it happen.
Yeah, he made it happen.
I still feel like I could use more information about the factors. You say that there were, trust was very important, and once that trust was there, things kind of fell into place. But I think Jeff is going to speak more about it too. But what are the specific factors? So these are all folks who are here learning more about EB-5, and they're, in their minds they're going, so what's sort of the checklist of things that I need to look at when I'm evaluating whether or not I trust a regional center? So what are some of those specific factors?
For sure, I will explain this, and this is important for them, because it's very easy to get into this discussion about the choice of regional center and get caught up into discussions about projects and term sheets and stuff like that. So you need to look at the regional center, and you need to look at projects separately. I think the bigger decision is the regional center, and the things that I looked at were things like, what's the history of the regional center in terms of it? How long have they been operating? What's been their track record in terms of the various different kind of projects? What are their petition approval rates in terms of the I-526 petition, which is what you nicely explained. I wish we can take the video recording of it. It was succinctly and brilliantly explained. The I-526 approval, the numbers there, and we look at. The other thing that I looked at was what's the kind of I-829 approvals, because eventually once the green card, 2 years have passed, you want to see that the conditions are removed. So we look at the I-829 approval rates. And finally, the most important thing is what I looked at was the repayment track record. For me, that was important. I'm a Gujarati investor. For me, money is very important. I always maximize my returns. So that was something which I very acutely looked at. I want the money back. I want the money back on time. We guys calculate interest on a daily basis. So repayment track record was very critical.
I just want to point out as an immigration lawyer what that means. So what that means is that Can-Am, as a regional center, has gone through the full cycle of several projects. So that means 526 approvals for investors, 829 approvals, lifting of conditions. So that's at the end of the immigration process. And then commercially, honoring the agreement, or not the agreement, but the success, realizing the success of that project, and being able to return the capital at the end of that whole business cycle to investors. So, and not a lot of regional centers have achieved that. There are hundreds of regional centers, but very, very few who have achieved that entire cycle. So congratulations. I think that's really notable.
And Caroline, that was actually the deciding factor for me when, and I looked at a lot of other regional centers as well. And for me, that was the tipping point in terms of the decision matrix, the repayment track record.
And I think this question is sort of meant to be self-serving, so I'm a little bit self-conscious about it. So what's the role of an immigration attorney in all of this?
Well, I think it's absolutely important to have a very good immigration attorney in this process, because, see, I'm a chartered accountant, so I do read term sheets for a living, but not everybody else would be doing that, right? So it's important to have somebody who is on your side, helping you to think through your options, helping you to evaluate the documents that need to be created, helping you to create those documents. One very important document which I would recommend anybody who's looking at EB-5 is the sources of fund document, which is at the heart of your I-526 approval. And according to me, it's impossible to do that unless you have a good immigration attorney guiding you through that process in terms of how do you really present a source of funds which can withstand the scrutiny of USCIS. At the same time, also, it's something which is tax efficient in the long run.
So I'll just say a word about the role of the immigration attorney in preparing your source of funds case. So on the one hand, it's actually quite intuitive. It really is. We have lots of immigration lawyers around the country, and we do CLEs, continuing legal education, helping and training other attorneys to represent investors. And what I always say to them is it's about creating a narrative and an exhibit, supporting evidence that is going to make sense to the examiner. The examiner is going to use his or her common sense in trying to understand how this investor got the funds, earned the funds, were gifted the funds to make his or her EB-5 investment. And so use your common sense. There isn't a lot of law here. It's the legal standard is lawful source of funds. So in the course of advising your client, if you think that there's a gap, so you worked at Citibank from 2008 to 2011, but we don't have anything from 2012 to 2014. Well, that's an obvious gap. You don't need, to master the regulations to know that that's something you want to go back to the client with and work that out. So there's a very intuitive part to it, and then there's also having a feel for where USCIS is. USCIS has moods. Sometimes it is looking for certain things above other things. It emphasizes earned income evidence, bank statements, other times tax records. So it's good. There are a lot of great lawyers in this space, and that's where experience comes in, is sort of getting a sense for what USCIS is looking for at that particular moment.
Yeah, if I could just add to that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There's only two ways you'll get a denial in EB-5, and one is on the project side, which is what Can-Am does. The other side is your source of funds. So with Carolyn, with the attorneys we work with, we have to make sure, we don't want denials, right? We have to give you your money back if you get a denial. You don't want a denial, obviously, you want to come to the US. So for us, we only work with immigration attorneys, and the investor picks their own immigration attorney, who is not just an immigration attorney, but is an EB-5 attorney. It's a completely different skill set. So it's important that you find someone who has a lot of experience, has reached all of the milestones with their investors in EB-5. And just as important, I think, is to find someone who has experience in the country where the funds are coming from, because that's another big piece of it.
Agreed. Each country has special little rules, and it's good to have attorneys who are experienced in that country.
If I can add one thing here, money in bank is just not source of funds. A common perception that I found with a lot of my Indian friends is that just because the money is in bank, they started saying, okay, I have a source of funds. It is slightly more complex than that, in terms of making sure that is detailed out right to the source of how that whole investment was created, and it's documented well. So
it's actually I always worry about those cases, because if a client has a lot of money sitting in an account, it's very rare that the client will be able to trace every dollar that's been sitting in that account. It's been accumulating. It's the product of other investments. There have been movements in and out of that account over a period of time. So it would be very hard to identify isolated transactions that resulted in those proceeds landing in that account. So, and often high net worth individual clients who are often EB-5 investors have that. They've got, funds sitting in an account, and often those funds are not good candidates for EB-5 investment. Sometimes they are, but often not.
But they also can be remedied, and we can work. I mean, I had to really work through that because I'm an investor. I had a lot of transactions, and you can imagine, and I went through a scrutiny which would involve a 5-year plan out. But the point is that can also be solved with a good immigration attorney. So, if your case is slightly complicated as far as the source of funds is concerned, do not lose heart. Work with Carolyn.
I was going to say, I would also bet Nilesh had the documents over those span of years that supported each and every transaction. So that also helps the attorney.
And why is the government interested in the source of funds? Just to show you how important this is to them, the person who was put in charge of EB-5, I guess about 5 years ago, was a person who came from the Treasury Department, from FinCEN, because the U.S. government's very concerned about money laundering. And that's kind of the driving force as to what kinds of documents they want to see, because if they see somebody with a large amount of money in a bank account, that doesn't impress them. They want to know where you got that money, what was the source of that funds. And we've had cases involving clients from certain countries where they've traced it back. Somebody will say, I got money from my parents, and they'll want to know where the parents got the money from, and so forth. If they sold a house, how much was the house worth at the time they purchased it? How much did they sell it for? Because sometimes there's money laundering involved in the sale of properties. So that's the key as to why they're doing it. And I think once you understand that, it's a lot easier to kind of deal with the minutia of how you prove the case.
Yes, I agree. All right, Jeff, are you ready? Ready, buddy? Okay, here we go. So now we're going to talk about the fact that the EB-5 interest that investors are purchasing when they make that investment is actually a security that's regulated by U.S. securities law. So, Jeff, I'm just going to open it up to you and let you start this discussion about.
Great. This was in the very beginning of EB-5. there was some debate as to what is the nature of this thing you're investing in. It wasn't really dealt with as a security because people looked at EB5 not as a way to make money, but as an immigration tool. Turns out it really is a security. And after some litigation and other things, back in 2011, Tom had the foresight to say, you know what, I don't know anything about securities. Let me do it the right way and found a broker-dealer. So Can-Am developed their own broker-dealer back in 2011. We were the first regional center to do it. I think there's only 2 regional centers that have their own broker-dealers now. The reason for that is I could not be here talking to you right now and talking to you individually afterwards if I wasn't a member of a broker-dealer. This is a security. If a security is being sold in the US, it must be sold through a regulated broker-dealer. And that's what Can-Am Investor Services is. So if you are approached in the US by someone to invest into a regional center project, the first thing you should ask is, are you a registered broker? And if the answer is no, that's a pretty bad sign for them. If they're willing to cut corners on the securities aspect, they'll probably cut corners elsewhere as well.
So,
and if the lawyer recommends it, you know that there's a serious problem.
Yes.
Right. You know, most, I think, and certainly Carolyn does this too. I mean, you know, we don't recommend a particular company. Doing that creates lots of problems. But I think what Nilesh is saying before, it's pretty obvious which ones have been successful. And often lawyers will tell you, well, I can tell you which ones have gotten approvals from immigration, but if you start talking about the quality of the investment, unless you're a broker-dealer, you have no business doing that as a lawyer. So a lawyer who's telling you this is a great investment, you should do that, you should be very wary of.
Agreed. Also, some attorneys, immigration attorneys, were in the practice of receiving commissions, essentially.
Yeah.
Transaction-based compensation for referring investor clients to regional centers, and that is also not permitted because they are not registered broker-dealers.
Right. And it's a huge conflict of interest. You wouldn't want the immigration attorney who's looking out for your best interest filing to be getting paid by me. Right? Obviously, they're going to point you in my direction.
Right. So as a registered broker-dealer regulated by FINRA, how would a broker-dealer evaluate the match between that investor and the EB5 opportunity?
Right. The broker-dealers all have a responsibility to make sure an investment is suitable. So outside of the EB5 space, if I'm working for a securities company, non-EB5, and I speak to someone who's an 80-year-old pensioner, and I try to get her to invest into a startup, a risky startup, obviously that's not a suitable investment, right? I wouldn't be doing my job. I can get correctly, I can get in a lot of trouble for that. Same thing in EB5. We have to make sure the investment is suitable for you in 2 fronts. First is the immigration side. So we always make sure we find out the investor's past immigration history. If they've had denials for things that we think might lead to problems in the future, we may not let them invest. Sorry. If they have any criminal history, things like that, right? Those would all preclude them from investing into our project. Then there's the financial side. We only take accredited investors. Accredited investors have a net worth of $1 million or have made $200,000 a year for the last 2 years and reasonably believe they'll make that in the future, or $300,000 a year for married couples. So all accredited investors, that's one way we protect ourselves and make sure the investment's suitable. The other thing is, if someone comes to me and says, you know, this is really important for me, this is my last $500,000, the conversation ends there. EB5 is not for you because the money has to be at risk. It doesn't have to be risky, and we can talk about that later, but it has to be at risk. So there's potential you could lose your money. If you tell me it's your last $500,000 in the world, I don't want you to invest with us. I want to be able to sleep at night. So we have to make sure that you can earn a living, you can afford to have not touch this money for 5 to 7 years, and that you're not counting on any returns from that. Because as we'll talk about a little bit, proper EB5 investments are not lucrative. There's very little financial return. Your return in general is going to be immigration. So you need to have that money put away and not earn anything off of it.
So let's get into that a little bit. So now the investors understand that there is a suitability review component that should be undertaken between the investor and the issuer or the regional center. Can you give us some color about the conversation that might happen between an investor who wants to explore, what are the returns, the commercial aspects of this deal that they're about to or thinking about undertaking?
I don't want to stereotype too much, but I've been in India probably 12 times the last 3 years. On average, our interaction with an investor takes 3 to 6 months, and we get asked somewhere around 100 questions. In Nilesh's case, I think it was about 200 probably. So we go through every aspect of the deal. What we try to do is make sure the investor understands the risk and understands the value proposition of what this investment is. I was just saying before this, I was speaking to someone, a potential investor of ours, and the outcome in EB5, unlike any other investment you're going to make, is binary. If you invest in a project with us and it's the most successful project in the history of EB5, you're going to get a green card and you're going to get your money back. If the project is only marginally successful, you're going to get a green card, you're going to get your money back. There's no upside, right? So the idea for you as an investor is to get the risk as low as possible, right? Because you care mostly about immigration and preservation of capital. So we go through with each investor, they'll get 200 pages of documents, go through every aspect of the project. The capital stack, sources of financing, the developer's history, all of these different things. And we'll go back and forth and make sure you understand all the risks. But honestly, I think you can really narrow it down to 2 things to start with. First is, as Nilesh spoke about, is the regional center. What is their track record? I think to me, most important is, have they completed the cycle, right? And my teenage kids cringe all the time because I discovered memes and how to send them out. And so I get called cringy every day. But my favorite one, and I send it to my sales team, and I love to send it to my sales team and to send it to potential investors because they'll talk about this great new project in EB5 that no one's ever done it this way. It's really special, and these people will be able to get returns and all this other things. And it's a meme I send out, which is a picture of a guy skydiving without a parachute. And it says, everybody in the world can skydive once without a parachute. And that's how I feel about EB5. If you're going to go with someone who's never done it before, why would you? You want to make sure they've gone through every aspect and they have that experience. So start there. What's your experience in EB5? What's your track record? The next thing is, you look at EB5 it's structured as a loan. In general, there are developers who are going to build a project, build a building. We have an office tower we're financing right now. And they are looking for financing. And our financing is cheaper than everybody else's. That's why they want EB5 money. So the next easiest way to evaluate the project is, ask someone, what interest rate is the developer paying? Everyone in this room, I'm sure, understands credit. If you have great credit, strong income stream, you go to get a mortgage for $1 million, you're going to pay 3.5%. If your credit isn't as good, you're going to pay 4%, or not be able to get a mortgage, right? It's the easiest way to evaluate risk is by looking at what rate the borrower is paying. And I will tell you, a lot of times you'll have people in EB5, developers who want EB5 money because either they can't raise it any other way, and they think this is an easy way to get the money, or they put their investors in such a position where they have no real collateral in the deal, and they'll pay 10, 11% interest in the US for money. I mean, we all know how low interest rates are here in the US. If someone's paying 11% for EB5 money, they're not very creditworthy. On average, our borrowers pay 2 to 4%, right? Sub-market interest rate. And we make a living by taking the difference between what you get, and which is approaching 0, and what the borrower pays.
Great. So some takeaways, let me make sure I understand. So the EB5 investor is evaluating the risks of a particular project. They're going to look at the regional center and the track record and whether they've completed a cycle, and if not, where they are. And in terms of looking at the project, which is separate, one of the key things that an investor is going to look at is the credit risk of the underlying borrower.
Right.
Okay. Anything else? Those seem very simple, very clear. Are there like a second layer of inquiry that we can just kind of graze on?
Yeah, sure. So we spoke about the capital stack, what goes into a project. For instance, the current project we're doing right now is an office tower in New York City. You want to know the developer has a track record and a history. They've done this before. So
kind of like the regional center in that respect.
Kind of like the regional center in that respect, right? So names we've worked with before in this business, we've worked with like Time Warner, Comcast, Sony Pictures, major players. Tishman Speyer is the developer we're working with now, an $80 billion developer. So you want to know they have experience. And then you want to know the developer has skin in the game. We don't do projects unless the developer has 35% equity, 35 to 50% equity. In our current project, our developer has 50% equity. So in other words, they have to lose half of the investment before we lose anything. So we have access to that capital as collateral, right? We're a lender, just like a bank is. So you want to make sure there's really strong developer has skin in the game, and you want to make sure that the developer also has other financing in place for the entire project. If the project's $100 million, if it's a $100 million project, we would love to see the developer with $50 million in. We'd put, say, $10 million of EB5 money in, and then there'd be another lender, usually a large bank, that will put in the other $40 million.
So Jeff, you said that on average you get 100 questions from the average Indian investor. Don't go through the full 100, but what would you say are top 5 common questions that you get? And could you give us a sense of how you answer those questions?
Yeah, the number one question I always got, so I've been going to India for 3 years. In the beginning, EB5 was unknown, and so people thought it was a scam. Now when I go there, people are aware of EB5. It's gotten a lot of traction. So the first question I always get, we always brag, Ken, and we brag about our track record. So we've had close to 6,000 investors with us. We have 4,300 I-526 approvals, over 2,000 I-829 approvals, and by the end of this year, we'll have repaid our billionth dollar to investors. To put that in perspective, and this is where I'm bragging, the rest of the industry has probably returned about 500 million to investors or less. So we have 2 to 3 times the track record of the entire industry in terms of returning capital. I tell this to people and they go, how do we know that's true? So there's no central clearinghouse in EB5.
How do they know it's true?
Right. So they initially they had to take
Jeff, how do they know?
Initially they had to take my word for it. That was a difficult sell. But then earlier this year we hired PKF, an international accounting firm, to do a forensic audit of our track record. So they were here for 6 months on site with us, going through every single approval. Sorry. I must have odd-shaped ears.
You got it.
Going through every single approval, money into the project, money out of the project, money back to the investors. So we have that audit. That's one way. The other way is we're a broker-dealer. So I'm the CEO of the broker-dealer. Can-Am Investor Services is a broker-dealer registered with FINRA. You can go online in BrokerCheck and you can find out any complaint ever lodged against me in my 20-year career, against our broker-dealer, et cetera. So complete transparency. We've always had that, which is good. You can see complaints, where we've worked, what we've done, any type of warnings, other issues that we've had in the past. So that's how we were able to address that. That was the first thing. The next thing is everybody try to get me to say the word guarantee. There are no guarantees in EB5. In fact, your money has to be at risk as per the provisions of the program. So if someone says guarantee, if it was true, you wouldn't get an approval, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the peculiarity of EB5 is that it doesn't really conform to normal business practices, in the sense that you would want to have a guarantee if you could, but under immigration law, if you have a guarantee, then your money's not at risk, and therefore they won't approve the project. So it's kind of a peculiar situation, but there are ways to address what at-risk means, and I assume Carolyn and I will probably talk a little bit about what at-risk is. But it is always lurking in the background, because the things that you would normally look at as safeguards, you cannot have in a EB5 investment, except for the kinds of things Jeff's saying, which is you look at the track record, you look at how much money they've actually paid back. You have somebody carefully read the documents, and that's what you're hiring a lawyer to do, which is not always the case. There are things you can do to build in a certain set of safeguards, but one of those is not that your money is guaranteed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would suggest, and no one, I wouldn't say no one, many people, most do not take us up on this, but you're investing $500,000 plus some other fees associated with it, your attorney fee, etc. Your family's future is on the line here. And I always say to people, if you're not that financially sophisticated, hire someone independent, pay $5,000, whatever I don't know what the cost is, to have a professional evaluate the project as well. And people balk at that, and I don't really get that. We love that. I love when someone pays someone from the outside to evaluate our project. But you're putting all this money at risk and your family's future, I would definitely do that.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on that. I've actually never understood this. People putting in $500,000, sometimes they're putting in $1 million, and you tell them go get someone to really investigate whether or not this is a good investment or not. And what Jeff's saying is true. You often balk at paying that extra $5,000, which, if you think about it, is kind of crazy. And the classic here was a Project J Peak, which Callan and I know a lot about, which was kind of the gold standard for many years in this industry, and it turned out it was a Ponzi scheme. And had somebody really looked at it very carefully, they probably would have figured that out.
So that is a perfect segue into our last and final chapter, which is we want to discuss for you some of the things that are happening, risks, okay, that you need to understand. And hopefully we can also share a word or two about how you can understand and manage that risk. And a good way to talk about that is some of the litigation that's been happening in the EB5 space. And Ira just mentioned one very prominent one, a fraud case involving a prominent regional center project, J Peak. It was a darling project in the EB5 space. And it won the support of an important senator from Vermont, Senator Leahy, who had been a proponent of EB5 before this broke out. So how, Jeff and Ira, and Nilesh too, how would you discuss litigation and these other pockmarks in our space in terms of risk to investors that they should be aware of, and how they might navigate around those risks?
Well, I don't discuss unless somebody pays me. So.
Well, you're
Is
getting
that true, Tom?
No. We're getting a glass of wine outside.
Well, look, immigration has this great instinct of always going after the wrong issue. And, it's what I was saying before. They're really concerned about money laundering, and they're really concerned about the source of funds, which makes sense. So instead of focusing on that, they decided to come up with this concept that your money is not at risk if you got a loan from the bank for the $500,000, but the collateral that you used was your parents' collateral. And they say, well, that means your money's not at risk, which is probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard, because the regulation itself says cash. In other words, if you invest cash, and that's what you're getting from a bank when you get a loan, you get cash, and you put it in a Can-Am project, you've invested cash. The government has taken this view that cash is not cash if it is backed by collateral that may not be 100% yours. So we have cases which we're litigating now in Washington, D.C., of clients who put in, they got a loan from the bank and they put up their property, but it wasn't quite 500,000. So they got their parents to put up their property. So now you had enough for the bank to satisfy the bank, and they've said that's not an investment.
So that risk there is agency caprice, because they are misconstruing the regulations definition.
Their own regulation, right. Yeah. So I think that's one of the areas, obviously. The other one I mentioned had to do with how they count the visas, that they count for every investor. They count the spouse, they count the children. Each one gets a visa. That increases the numbers of visas toward the 10,000 cap. We think that it's an interesting issue. I don't think it's such a black or white issue. It's complex. But that issue will have a lot to do with how many visas we'll have available over the next year or two, and we'll probably get an answer within the next 6 months on that. I don't know. I mean, there's been backlogs. So one of the things that we do a lot of is we file mandamus actions, which is to compel the government to make a decision. So if your petition's been pending for 2 years because the administration wants to slow everything down, that you have recourse. You can go to court. You can ask a federal judge to compel the government to give you an answer, whatever that answer is. It's a good answer or a bad answer, but an approval or a denial, but they can force the agency to actually take action and get that approved. And we've had other cases, like what's the question of book value, and but those are direct investment cases, I think, more than regional center cases. But over the years, we've had our share of litigating lots of these different discrete issues, and we've been pretty successful, I think.
Very successful.
Can I come
yes.
on this?
Go ahead.
So this is from the perspective of the people here in the audience. These topics that you spoke about, like JPEG or the litigation issues, a common thing that a lot of investors do is that they just try Googling it. And when you Google EB5, all the stuff that comes up is a lot of negative press about these things.
Yeah.
What I would recommend each one of you is that don't just read what is there on the internet and believe it. Please consult your immigration attorney. There are multiple aspects to it. Somehow what you get in the Google search is all negative stuff, unfortunately. Don't go by that. It's not as simple as it looks from those news articles. So they raised a couple of points. There are many more points that you will unearth when you do your own research. But at every stage, I strongly recommend talking to you, whichever attorney that you decide to retain, because it's not straightforward.
I think that's really good advice. And one of the things you look at are the kinds of things that Jeff is saying. Have they paid people back? When I started doing this, there were three regional centers. What are there now? 600?
900.
And, in any kind of mass group like that, you're going to get some fraudsters. You're going to get some people who have an idea that they're going to create this project, and they're just like any entrepreneur, the project just doesn't work. And the government's position is, well, that was the whole point. Your money was supposed to be at risk. And if the project failed, it's too bad. You lose your money. You lose the ability to get the green card. And that's why it's incumbent upon you, in terms of what Nilesh is saying, is you get a competent lawyer, someone like Carolyn, not me, but someone like Carolyn who really knows what she's doing. And, you talk to them about what this particular investment is, and maybe you even hire somebody to really look at the investment to see if it's worthwhile.
And I think that this crowd is really well positioned to be well informed. You're here in the United States. You have access to information. You have access to a number of different kinds of experts and professionals. And you're entrepreneurs, and you're superbly prepared for success. in a very competitive arena. So you're really the ideal kinds of investors who are going to do that diligence, do your research, understand the products, and ask the questions and get the help. So you're well prepared and positioned to do the kinds of research that we're talking about.
And can I just add one thing to that? I'm sorry. Just a couple of things when you're looking. If it looks too salesy, too good to be true, it probably is.
The Madoff effect.
Yeah, there's some red flags. That I-526 approval that Carolyn was talking about, from the regional center side, it's easy. Honestly, it's a joke. I could hire a business plan writer, pay him $2,000, and I'll get an I-526 approval, okay? Not a big deal. Anyone that brags about 100% track record I-526 approval, meaningless. You haven't done anything except submit a business plan. I-829 approval is when you actually create the jobs. So you'll see these regional centers that will advertise 100% approval. That's a lie, right? 100% approval on the easiest thing in the world. One of the big red flags for me with J-Peak, and I was shocked when I came into this industry 4 years ago, on their website it said guaranteed by the state of Vermont. I couldn't believe that I read that. That was allowed. That's why these poor investors got taken advantage of. If I was an investor in China and someone said to me, well, there's this company Can-Am, I don't know, whatever, but here's the state of Vermont guaranteeing a project, I'd sign up with them right away. Right? So that was something that really bothered me. Seeing that out there. So when you see things like that, or you see people brag about I-526 approvals, but then nothing about I-829 approvals or repayments, clear signs that they're probably advertising more than they can deliver.
And I think one good turn of events is that the Securities and Exchange Commission has gotten very involved in aggressively going after companies that are committing fraud. And that's good for companies like Can-Am. It's good for companies that are reputable and that are involved in the industry, because it's a way of weeding out, the bad apples. And this is a major, project for the SEC now. I don't know, probably 30, 40, 50 maybe SEC cases. And some of these you're able to work out. I mean, we had one in Seattle, for example, where the SEC came in, they stopped the project. We brought in a white knight to finish the project, and everybody got their green cards. But it's good. It's actually healthy for this industry that they're taking such an aggressive position with respect to the security side of it.
Agreed. So let's talk about where we go from here in terms of the evolution of the program from a regulatory, statutory change standpoint. Who wants to take this on? Ira.
You want me to?
Come on. Yeah, just give him a brief overview.
Okay, I mean, there's been legislation pending. And Carolyn well knows that she's been involved in it. There's been legislation pending for a number of years in different forms, really instigated by Senator Grassley of Iowa, with the idea of trying to, in some sense, clean up what he perceives as cleaning up the industry. It's got a lot of provisions that would, I think, benefit investors. It's got a number of provisions that might ultimately hurt the industry for various reasons. So that's kind of one part of it. And there's been a war going on between Senator Grassley on the one hand and Senator Schumer from New York on the other as to really targeted employment areas and what that means for the industry. Target employment areas, as I think Carolyn explained, are areas where rural areas or areas of 150% unemployment. And Grassley feels, more visas should go to Iowa, which has lots of rural areas, and most of the visas are going to New York and other places because of the way they're addressing TEA. So that's become a big issue. The legislation hasn't gotten passed. There's a lot of frustration on Capitol Hill about it. At the same time, there are regulations that have been circulating And you know, the agency is always on the cusp of actually promulgating these regulations into a final form. And we've all been threatened for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years now that they're going to be finalized. They have not yet. Those regulations call for a step up in the amount of money that people would have to invest from $500,000 to $1.3 million. Whether or not that'll ever get passed, I've heard lots of different things on the Hill about it. It doesn't look like it's going to go through anytime soon. So for right now, the amounts are still the same, 500 and $1 million. And hopefully we're going to work on some legislation that's going to change the numbering and try and create more numbers for EB5.
That's the perfect note to end our presentation on. More capacity for this program that creates jobs and brings investment to U.S. companies. So I'm thrilled that we have time for questions. So, yeah, Mike.
I think we have mics, and you should really talk into the mic because we're recording.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you only offer these investments to accredited investors. My question is, I suppose you are issuing a PPM in your investor package, so why not entertain sophisticated investors as well?
Yeah, it was a decision we made a long time ago. This industry was under so much scrutiny that we wanted to make sure we were as compliant as possible. We've talked about changing that as well, maybe possibly allowing lesser number of non-accredited investors. But for now, I think it's more beneficial for us to just make sure everyone's accredited.
So according to the SEC laws, it should be all right for a sophisticated investor to invest through the EB5 route. It's just your company decided to not go that route.
Well, there are rules regarding, so sophisticated investor doesn't mean accredited. The way the SEC determines accredited investor, which I think is very flawed, is based on net worth. But the rules specifically speak to the number of non-accredited investors you can have inside an offering and what type of restrictions it puts on you. So us only accepting accredited investors allows us to change to the best way we think to send our offering out. So we review it consistently, but for now, really, the investment amount is $500,000. It doesn't take much more to get to the $1 million point to become an accredited investor, and if it goes to $1 million, it doesn't matter, which the program cost may go to $1 million in the future, at which point you'll have to be accredited.
Well, thanks, guys, for the information. This is very helpful. Appreciate that. Well, Nilesh, hopefully you have gotten your money back by now. So my question is more regarding the source of funds, right? So I know that's a kind of subjective criteria. So let's say, I'm just going to give a dummy example here. Let's say I have a family member in India, but at the same time, I can give him a gift or something like that to for him to apply for a visa. Is that admissible, or he particularly has to be accredited investor, so to speak, by himself?
So Jeff can address the accredited investor question. The source of funds question is yes. You, here in the United States, could gift your funds to friend or family member in India, and that family friend or family member could be the EB5 investor. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And so the way that would work is that in the source of funds documentation, we would kind of pierce through the investor because he's really not the source of the funds. You are. So we would go through him to you and look at where did you earn your source of funds to gift to your friend who is the investor in this case. So the analysis would shift to you, and we would kind of look at you as if you were the investor and work with you directly or through the investor to get your source of funds, your income or investment documents.
So the fund does not necessarily need to come from India, so to speak, or other countries.
Correct, yes. And in fact, U.S. sourced income is much easier for all the obvious reasons. The agency is familiar with the documents. They're familiar with U.S. tax filings and wage records. So, yeah, absolutely.
Hi. the litigation which you were talking about, is it going to in any way affect other EB categories, not to count the families visas against the count EB1, EB2, EB3? Is it going to affect that or only EB5?
The question is the derivative litigation going to address these and other categories?
The answer to that is the lawsuit is directed only toward EB5 because EB5 has a pretty strong legislative history where the proponents of EB5 in 1990 and in 92 talked about 10,000 investors, 100,000 jobs. But to indirectly answer your question, yes. I mean, if we won, it would have the next person could certainly bring a lawsuit on EB1 or EB2.
And that's kind of what we're hoping will be the collateral effect of this, is that it might be the thin end of the wedge that gets to the other EB categories.
So one last question is from my side. In the startup world here in Silicon Valley, can the source of funds also come from VC community? I mean, has it happened or it's just not possible to do that for an entrepreneur? If a VC invests in his startup, can that fund be considered? Has it been documented and proved and gotten approved as an EB5?
Do you mean the investment has done really, really well and...
Well, the jobs are anyways 2 years down the line, right? I mean, if an entrepreneur, a founder gets investment from VC community into his startup, minimum 10 employees join within the next 2 years is documented. Has that been done or can it be done as a valid source of funds?
So I'm not sure I understand the question, but so the company has received VC capital. And the company has created 10 plus jobs. So the issue would be, well, where is the investor's money? So the investor also has to have invested the required amount into that company. It's okay. If your question is it okay if the company received other capital? Yes, it is. That's okay. But the investor has to have invested his own capital in the company.
For the founder, not the investor. The money comes from the investor.
The question is like, you get 500K from an investor, from
angel
investor
investor,
capitalist, and then can you use that for the EB5 processing?
Well, the EB5 investor still has to put in the 500,000 or $1 million, depending on where it's located, if it's in a TEA or not. You can take the money from the company and simply use that. In other words, say you start a company, you put in $100,000 and the company becomes wildly successful and you want to use the money that's in the company to make up the difference on the 500,000. You really can't do that. You'd have to take the money out of the company. You'd have to pay taxes on it. It would have to be your own money and then you'd have to reinvest it.
Yeah.
So hi, this is little bit negative question though. So
I'm sorry.
This is little bit negative question though. So what if means like in the process of applying the EB5, if project is failed or the regional center is terminated during that time, will the money will gone?
Did you get that?
No, could you repeat that? I'm sorry. Can you
Did you get
it? Speak right into the mic.
So what I'm saying that if suppose project is failed, that project is failed.
Yeah.
Eventually, and or if the regional center is being terminated during that process. So investment, what it's gone investment or it's like money will be saved?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So you want to know what happens if the project has a failure. So it depends on when that happens.
Right.
So if you invest in a project and from the beginning your money goes in and no jobs are created and the company goes bankrupt, you will not get immigration, you will lose your money, period. if you invest into the project and it creates a bunch of jobs, but ultimately is not successful and the company fails, if they've created enough jobs for you, you will stay in the U.S. It has no effect on your immigration as long as those jobs are documented, but you won't get your money back. So there's two different spots.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit more complicated. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, there's one immigration wrinkle that Ira and I were going to jump into, which is the material change issue.
Yeah,
so
because it depends on when it is.
Immigration has a very odd rule in EB-5, and that is if there is a material change, and regional center termination is one, a material change, and the material change happens before the investor reaches conditional permanent residency. So to Jeff's question, it depends when this catastrophic event happens. If it happens after an investor is in conditional permanent residency, it's okay. It's not great, but it's not going to necessarily jeopardize your immigration. However, if the same thing happens before an investor is a conditional permanent resident, it has much more serious consequences, and it could unwind the immigration process if that change rises to the level of material change.
Yeah, so for example, if you have an I-526 that's approved, you become a conditional resident, okay, and then the jobs are created, but before the I-829 is either filed or approved, the company goes bankrupt. If the jobs were pending for the 2-year period, you could still get your permanent residency. So bankruptcy isn't always fatal. I think that's what Jeff was saying. It depends on, and Karen was saying, it depends on when it happens. That's why you need to consult an immigration lawyer.
Yeah, but Jeff is right.
But somebody who knows.
And the key thing to look at is were the jobs created. If this catastrophic thing happens early, then it's no good. If it happens after the jobs are created, then you've got something to work with, and you go through another layer of analysis. But if there's no jobs, then it's probably game over.
So after I put I-526, it's 2 years time, right?
For the pendency of the 526, yes. The current processing time is 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, so as I understand this process that you said is a 3-step process, and therefore it pretty much takes almost 4 years for us to get the green card, at least 4 years as I understand it. What in the due course of time, let's say on 3rd year, I'm a typical H1 person in EB2 category, and my priority date becomes current. I at that point of time would like to kind of pursue my 485 through the H1 category and withdraw from this program. So are there any options for me to kind of take back my money after maybe the 3rd year or the 4th year?
Yeah, okay.
That's going to be dependent on the regional center. I can tell you the way we work is if you are looking at EB-5 as a backup plan, it's not a good play, because once you release the money to us, you invest the money with us, we release it to the borrower for the loan term, which will be 5 to 7 years. So if your money has been released to the borrower and 2 years from now you get a green card through another route and you want your money back, we're not going to give it to you most likely. We're under no obligation to, because you already handed it off to the borrower who's counting on that money. So if you voluntarily withdraw, you're not entitled. In practice, we have helped people who've had bad circumstances, etc. We've gotten their money back for them. But if it's just used as a backup plan, it's not a good plan.
Good point.
Yeah, so the question is during this process. Okay, so the question is this includes the kids below age 21, right? But during this period, like 4 or 5 years of period, if the kids grow older than 21, will there be get the benefit of EB-5 or?
What was the question?
Age out. Yeah. If they turn 21 after that.
Oh. Okay, so under the Immigration Act, if you have a petition, let's say you have a child who's 20 years old, and the petition is pending until the child is 23, So the petition's now pending for 3 years. They then approve it at that point. There's something called the Child Status Protection Act that says those 3 years are not counted, so your child is still 20. Okay? However, to make it even more complicated, however, if at that point there's still no visa available because there's a backlog, this is the situation that we're suing under, that there's a backlog and the visa won't be available for another 5 years, your child ages out, because as soon as the child hits 21, they age out. So it's not the waiting time for the I-526. When you have backlogs, people haven't ever realized this, but when you have backlogs, it's actually a good thing that the petition's pending for years, because then the child's age isn't counted.
Okay, good evening, everyone.
You're going to have to interpret because I can't hear anything.
Can you hear? Yeah. Okay, my name is Jayes Nagrecha. First of all, I congratulate the distinguished panel for the excellent presentations for the indirect investments. Now, I think most of us are Indian Americans here. As some of us know that we are entrepreneurs. So I would like you to give some ideas about the direct investments for the benefit of some of us who are here, who are entrepreneurs. That was my first question. My second question is for the Nilesh. I know it's a bit private, but can you tell us the returns you got it? That's my second question. My third questions, sorry, I'm giving a lot of questions. Some of us might be interested in knowing the reforms which is coming in the H-1B. So if you can throw some lights on it. Thank you very much.
Okay. We're going to answer 2, but not 3.
Thank you very much.
Nilesh, do you want to?
No, I think you should start.
Okay. Sure, I'll give a brief explanation of direct versus indirect. So again, the key legal distinction, there's only one, is about job creation counting. In the regional center context, you just don't have to produce evidence of John, Mary, Jim, Harry, 6 other people, their W-2s, wage records, that they worked at least 35 hours a week, that they were full-time, and that you had 10 of them.
And they were legal.
And that they were legal, and that they have to be U.S. workers. And sometimes the direct clients get into trouble because they will have been good employers. They I-9'd, work authorization verified all of their employees. The service checks these records independently at the 829 stage and says, whoops, we're going to disqualify 6 of your 11 employees because by our records, they were actually not U.S. work authorized. That's not a good situation. But that's the proof for showing 10 jobs in the direct context. Regional center context, it's a modeling. It's a mathematical, economic modeling that happens to prove 10 indirect jobs. I'll say that there's also another distinction. It's not a legal distinction, but it is a distinction that arises in adjudication. There's also the engagement requirement for EB-5. So an investor is required to have some hand in the business. It can't be a purely passive investment. Now, as a practical matter, the threshold is very, very low. So you can engage in policy making as long as it's not purely passive. That's the true standard. However, in the direct context, in adjudication, USCIS is actually looking for, in its review of the bona fides overall of this petition, what is the investor's role? Because there's usually 1, maybe 2 or 3 at most investors in the direct context. So what are they going to do? It's expected that they're also going to be actively managing the enterprise. And so you want to include evidence of how they are actively engaged in the enterprise. So, and it's a challenge, right? When you're working and you've got a full-time job, to show that you're also actively engaged in managing this business that's also going to create 10 jobs eventually. But that's the proof. The distinction is in the proof, job creation and also level of engagement.
And in the regional center context, a lot of the litigation also turns on the methods that were used to count the jobs. So, there is Karen has mentioned the input-output models, but, there's also, if you put in a certain amount of money, it's supposed to count for a certain number of jobs. And there are always fights about that. I mean, we're involved in a case where the government said, no, it only created 40 jobs and you had 20 investors. You didn't do it, create enough jobs. And we had to have another economist take a look at it. And he said, no, they created enough jobs. And you go back and forth, and that's part of it.
So the second question, do we go for, we'll answer one more of your three. So Nilesh, do you want to share? Sure.
So I like to brag about my investing track record. So, I know the question is about the regional center, but I'm going to chip in here. So 12 years ago, when I started my investing career, I just had $10,000 with me, and here am I after 12 years. So I've really done well as an investor, but nothing of that is because of my EB5 investments. And I would encourage all of you that you're in Silicon Valley, make money by investing in startups, investing in Apple, Google. EB5 investments are just for getting an immigration benefit, as Jeff explained, and to look at any investment opportunity from a return perspective for EB5 is flawed on many levels. I think there are enough other opportunities. You and me can have a discussion offline. And I love doing investing talk. And Vish is also here. He'll also guide you about investing. So that is the way I would answer it.
Mm-hmm. All right, you got 2 out of 3. We're going to move on.
Yeah, I have 3 very quick questions. One. I assure you, just very quick. How soon do we get approval for I-526, and is it same for EB1 category 2? And apart from that, if let's say till the time we get I-526 approval, my visa status is going to expire, so can I still stay in US?
I'll take that. 526 petition takes around 18 to 24 months to be approved. Yes, you can have multiple immigrant visa petitions pending. So you can have I-140 going at the same time. You can have multiple I-140s going at the same time and 526. If you want to stay in the United States while the 526 petition is pending, you have to be in another immigration status that allows you to be here. The filing of a 526 or an I-140, that for that matter, confers no U.S. status.
Can we also do multiple 485s? You mentioned that we could do multiple I-140, I-140s.
Yeah.
Similarly, is it possible to do multiple 485s?
What was the question?
Multiple 485s. I mean, no, but you can port the 485s. The question is, can you?
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated question because it depends on. There's a special provision called 245K that says even if you're out of status for a certain period of time, you can still file your adjustment. But the basic rule is what Carolyn is saying, which is if you're out of status, you can't remain in the United States, and just the filing of an I-140, because that's not even your petition, it's the employer's petition, doesn't give you any right to be here. It's the filing of the I-485 that would. And could you file multiple 485s? I suppose if you had multiple job offers, you could do that. I think the one complication of all this is if you have an I-526 approved and you become a conditional resident, and then you want to adjust your status based on something else, can't do it. Unless you're married to an American citizen. Unless you're married to an American citizen. You know why? Because 245C8 says you can't adjust from a non-immigrant status.
That's
you can
why
only
need a
adjust
good
from a
immigration
non-immigrant
attorney.
status. Because the person...
You're witnessing
in
immigration history right here.
We'll talk about it later. We'll talk about it over dinner. We'll get that straight. But anyway, it's a complicated question, as you can tell, since we can't even figure it out.
I'm going to defer to Ira.
So
he always wins.
Hi. So in case one of us starts the process right now, what is end-to-end timeline looks like from starting right now, choosing an investment, filing 526, and finally getting the green card, removing the conditional, and taking out the money back. So what is the total time looks like?
What was the question?
The question is, what is the total timeline from beginning, starting to look at EB-5, to getting your permanent green card and getting your money back? I can start to answer that. So choosing the project will take you however long it takes you. From our side on the regional center, your immigration side, attorney side, how quickly can you get your source of funds documentation together, and how quickly can your attorney file? Usually a couple of weeks for you a couple of weeks for the immigration attorney, as long as you have all the documentation. Picking the project, as much due diligence as it takes you to do. It takes most of our investors, I don't know, a month to 3 months. But if you work at it full time, obviously you can do it much quicker. Then you apply. Once you submit your I-526, current wait times, Carolyn said right now, are 18 to 24 months. Right? At that point, you have to do adjustment of status, which is...
If a visa is available.
If a visa is available. Right. What's the adjustment of status time right now, averaging? I know.
I mean, with us, it's, taking a year.
Yeah, at least a year.
Yeah, about a year. I mean, you're looking at, to be in the U.S. on your conditional green card, roughly about 2.5 years, if things keep on moving. And then from there, another 2 years until you submit your I-829 to get the conditions removed, which the timeline on that now is about 2 years as well, or longer. And then the last piece is getting your money back. So our loans are structured 5 to 7 years, basically. So you can get your money back if, the way we work at least right now, is if you have an I-829 approval and the loan has matured. So if you've gotten your approval and our loan has a 5-year maturity, you can get your money back. If you haven't gotten your approval yet, the way we are set up currently, you cannot get your money back. Now, there is new advice from USCIS that says once you file, you're entitled to get your money back, your I-829.
Well, and one other thing about the conditional residence, so everybody understands that you are a resident. It just has a condition. So you're a lawful permanent resident of the United States. You can travel, you can work. All the time that you're a lawful permanent resident counts towards citizenship. So even if it takes you, we have lots of cases, I'm sure Carolyn does too, where by the time the person gets the final approval, the next day they can apply for citizenship if they want to, because the whole 5 years it's been running toward residency. So once you have residency on a conditional basis, I mean, if it's a good project, it's just like being a resident, and 2 years later, you're going to get your the condition lifted.
Lot of talk about the backlog in the EB-5 also.
So,
what was
sorry, we'll have an opportunity for that. We have one last question here.
Well, thank you. Great panel, and good to see you again, Jeff. Bert Vank, I'm half Indian, as you can tell. Lots of friends there. In the opening, you mentioned the restriction of the new commercial enterprise being in rural locations or of areas of high unemployment, none of which is applying to Silicon Valley here. Do I misunderstand that? Or what is the restriction for the place of incorporation? Or is there a strategy where you say, hey, I'll just go to Iowa, but I really have my team here in Silicon Valley? On getting the 10 employees maybe here? How does that count, and what do you advise for location strategy?
Sure, I'll take that.
Great, thanks.
Sure. So the test is where the business is principally doing business. Yeah. Yeah, and in the case of a regional center investment, it is where the job creating entity, remember Jeff talked about the loan, so we've got the fund, that's the new commercial enterprise, and it usually makes a loan to a developer. So the question for TEA purposes is where is the developer's project? Where is he principally doing business for that EB5 project? And so that developer can actually have its corporate headquarters somewhere else. And it could be formed in Delaware. It could be incorporated in Delaware. It could have its headquarters somewhere else. But the project site has to be in a TEA. And the policy manual has several criteria for determining where a job creating entity is principally doing business. And right now, the common understanding is the project site, regardless of where the corporate headquarters or the place of formation is. Does that make sense? And so to your other question of how does a TEA get formed, if it's rural, very, very simple, you look at the census data, Department of Commerce data, and if it's a population of 20,000 or fewer, it's rural. High unemployment TEAs, a little more complicated. First of all, a state is involved, state governments, it's state by state. It's usually like the Department of Labor. And a TEA can be formed by averaging high unemployment areas together. So the project site may not itself be sitting in let's say, a census tract that has 150% of the average, but taken together with other census tracts around it has to have 150% of the national unemployment rate.
And that's been the source of the controversy in EB5, because how do you have an area of high unemployment in the middle of Manhattan?
Yeah. But by the way, so this is what Senator Grassley has not liked, the gerrymandering. But I will say that I think this argument doesn't have a lot of weight, because the economic studies, the job creation studies that are submitted with these regional center projects have the economic area circled out based on commuting patterns. Where is the labor coming from that feeds this project site? So when you look at that commuting shed, it's often actually several counties. And when you look at the gerrymandered census tracts, it's a number of census tracts, but they're often they're within the county. They're within Manhattan or across the river, and in some census tracts in Brooklyn or in other boroughs. But the point is, these are areas, yes, gerrymandered, yes, but they are smaller than the commuter shed where the labor, the workers who are working on that project site are actually coming from. So I've never agreed. I thought Senator Grassley kind of had the policy argument all backwards there, but that is, as Ira says, a controversial aspect of the program.
Thank you. No, I'm just going to, I think everybody has said everything we needed to say. I just want to make one point. And I think that what you have seen here, you really need a really good, qualified EB5 immigration attorney to do this. This is not just about source of funds. As you can see, a lot of the complicated issues, and I can tell you, we've been in this for a long time. This program is organic. The rules that the USCIS enforces changes over time. You need people who are on top of things. Even our offering materials, we want the Carolines and the Iras of the world to review them periodically to make sure we're on top of what's going on at the USCIS. It's not just source of funds. It's much broader than that, and you can see the scope of the kind of questions here. So that's a big deal, and I think the team you have is incredibly important. Again, I think when we started this, we said, you're not wasting your time. I think this panel speaks for itself. These are some of the best, and we're so thrilled that you guys were here, and I am really grateful to both of them, and to Jeff and Nilesh, and to obviously Jay and Ty for hosting this. But thanks. They're going to be around. We're all here to ask questions, so thank you again for coming.